world of cable news screaming and social media echo chambers, it's easy to lose the signal in the noise. Every day, policy is debated, votes are cast, and your tax dollars are spent. We cut through the headlines to bring you the critical context you need, focusing on what's really going on in news and politics. Welcome to the Analytical Iowan Podcast. This is your daily dose of fact-driven politics. Let's analyze today's news. Here's Eric.
We are back on the Analytical Iowan Podcast. It is Monday, November 17th, as you are listening to this. And of course, it's another week. We got more shit to talk about. Now, some of the big news that came out yesterday was Donald Trump has done a 180 on the Epstein files. He has been desperate to come out with any sort of strategy when it comes to the Epstein files. Release them, don't release them. He's trying to distract away from it. Well, there are Democrats. There's nothing to see. It's a hoax. Are we still talking about that guy? He has tried everything. And now he can finally see the writing on the wall. And what is his new strategy? Well, now he comes out and he's basically daring congressional Republicans to release the Epstein files. He said, go ahead and vote for it. Now, whether he believes the Senate is going to kill it and not vote past it, or if he believes that it's going to get to his desk and he is going to be able to turn around and veto it, and well, that's the end of that, type deal. Now, we've been talking a lot about these Epstein files, and the discharge petition has enough signatures. Mike Johnson cannot stop the vote. Now, I know some people were trying to say that he was going to use the Epstein files as some sort of a leverage tactic to get the Affordable Care Act subsidies passed. I don't see that happening. There are more calls now from Republican members of Congress. We are hearing 40, 60, maybe even 100 members of the Republican Party are going to vote to release the Epstein files, at least in the House of Representatives. So what does that mean for Donald Trump? Well, if 100 flip and go with all Democrats, that would put them well past a veto-proof majority. Okay, so that means that if they vote to keep the files hidden, or they vote to release them, that there would be enough votes if Donald Trump chooses to veto it to go past it. And then we have the Senate who, if it just barely squeaked by, they may try to bury it. But if it goes through at that big of a margin, all eyes are going to be on the Senate. They're going to have to take it up. Now, they may try to delay it for as long as they possibly can. But the simple fact of the matter is they're going to probably have to vote on it at some point, and it will probably pass, maybe with a veto-proof majority over there as well. So why has Donald Trump changed his tune? Well, he changed his tune to release the files and say, well, yeah, vote to release them. Because somebody got to him, and somebody has convinced him that the files are going to be released, that they will pass it, and he is hoping that either the Senate will kill it or that he's going to be able to veto it, one way or the other. And it's going to buy him time to come up with a better strategy. He hasn't come up with anything yet, but he keeps thinking, well, if I can delay it for another week or two, I'll come up with something. I'm brilliant. I know I can get there. I've seen this kind of behavior before, maybe not with a deal like this, but it reminds me of a friend of mine who used to go to the pawn shop all the time. Never had enough money to pay his bills, but he'd get short, $50, $100, whatever. He would take some stuff to the pawn shop just to get enough to cover his bills right now, and he would worry about paying the interest on that pawn loan later. Then when that interest came due and the next time he was short on bills, he'd take even more stuff over, get a little bit more, pay the interest on the first set of items, get himself caught up, worry about it later. Eventually it got to the point where he couldn't do that anymore. Pawn shop was at its limit for what they would borrow him, even though he had been a perfect client and had gone for years doing this strategy. And then, of course, when he came into some money, he'd go get stuff back out. But he didn't fix the problem, the underlying problem, anywhere around. And then suddenly he was taking stuff back, and it was a never-ending thing. He ultimately lost everything he had taken to the pawn shop and wasted years of interest payments. Whereas if he would have just sold the stuff the first time, gotten caught up on bills, he would have been done. But he kept thinking, well, if I buy myself a month or 2 months, I will be fine. I will figure a way out of it. And he never did. That's what Donald Trump is doing with the Epstein files here. He is trying to buy himself another month or two, get it out of the narrative, kill it for now. We'll move on. And if he spins it, well, I want him released. Then the story isn't, well, the House passes it. Is it going to be enough to override his veto? Because now it sounds like Donald Trump is going to vote for it or he's going to sign it. So he's trying to control that narrative to make it seem like it's something else. He does not want these released. His name's already being brought up. I mean, we've spent the last few days talking about Donald Trump and Bubba and finding out it is not Bill Clinton, but we don't know who Bubba is. This is embarrassing to Donald Trump. He doesn't, even if there's nothing about Donald Trump with underage girls in there, what has already been released is embarrassing enough to Donald Trump that he doesn't want any of the rest of it to see the light of day. But he is so desperate that now he is willing to say, go ahead, vote for it. That way, the other side of it is when they do vote for it and they pass it, he can say, well, see, I told them to vote for it. That's the only reason they voted in those kind of numbers. They're not breaking with me because everyone has been talking about how Republicans are going to break with Donald Trump on the matter of the Epstein files, that they're going to break in large numbers. And this is the first real test of Donald Trump having control over the party, whether or not he's going to be able to get them to go along with what he wants and vote his way, etc. And it's not looking good for him. And the more that comes out, the louder the cry to release the files is becoming, the more Republicans are going to dogpile on this. Now, how does this play out? Well, ultimately, I think Wednesday is when they're holding the vote. And I fully expect Wednesday for this thing to get blown wide open. I'm thinking it is going to pass with 100 Republicans and all Democrats. That would be like 314 to 120 or something like that was what's left in the House. It's not even going to be close. And then it'll go to the Senate. Senate's going to probably have to vote on it. Like I was saying earlier, if it had barely passed or they could find a way to reasonably get around it, they'd probably ignore it. But it didn't. It's passing with large numbers. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to have to probably vote on it, and they're probably going to get at least enough to go around Donald Trump's, or to get it past the filibuster at least. Now, whether they get enough for going over a veto, I don't know. So does Donald Trump sign it? I don't think so. Even though he's publicly saying release the files now, he's trying to buy himself a week or two to delay this to get to the point where he can veto it, and then that'll buy him a week or two. And like I said, he's all about getting the distraction and trying to come up with some way of moving that goalpost just far enough outside of the reach so that it looks like he's on the up and up. So what happens here? Does he sign it? No, it'll go back to the House. Now, one of the things people are talking about is this idea that Donald Trump could use a pocket veto. Now, normally, if you veto a bill, it goes back to the House or the Senate. I think it goes back to the chamber that originated the bill. And they have so many days in order to pass it around his veto, or it's dead and they have to start over again. Now, why is there time limits? Well, something I haven't covered in a podcast yet, but I've been thinking about this. So I think it's like 10 days in order to pass it around his veto, or they have to pass the bill again. And that prevents something like what could happen here. Okay? Scenario being Donald Trump vetoes it, it goes back to Congress. If they don't have enough to pass it around his veto, they can't just let it sit there and wait till after the midterms, after the new Congress, when they've got entirely different people, and a year and a half later pass it around his veto. It prevents that kind of thing. So they only have like 10 days. And if they're in session, they would start the process of passing it around Donald Trump's veto. Now, I do not know for sure if Mike Johnson would be able to delay this with saying, well, we're not going to bring it up for a vote. If he could just kill it that way. Problem is, I'm not 100% sure. I believe they can use the discharge petition to bring this back up again, potentially to pass it around a veto. But I'm not 100% sure on that. I don't know if it only works on the first time through or if they can use it again. I know they can use it on multiple pieces of legislation separately. So you could have them trying to pass this around his veto. But a pocket veto is where Donald Trump would wait because he only has 10 days to sign it or it goes into being law if he doesn't veto it. So Donald Trump could try to wait out that 10 days and wait till Congress is gone and then veto it and start their clock. Well, if they're not back in a certain number of days, it would be considered dead. But one of the ways around that is something the House and the Senate already do, and that is these pro forma sessions. That is where they designate one person of the majority party to stay back in Washington whenever they go on recess. And they don't all stay back the whole time, right? If they're gone for 2 weeks, that person that gets designated might show up for 1 day out of those 2 weeks and then leave. Then it's somebody else's turn or whatever. But that person would be there, and it usually goes about every 3 days. Every 3 days they come in, they gavel in, said, okay, assuming everybody's here, if there is no objections, we're going to go and we're going to be done for the day. We'll be back in 3 days. And they gavel out, they close the session. Now, the thing is, they assume there is a majority, and they do it very quickly, not, in a span of just a few minutes, and then they go home. But why do they even do that? Why don't they just say we're adjourned for 2 weeks? Because being out for longer than several days has already been ruled on by the Supreme Court. Now, there's nothing unconstitutional about them being gone like that, except there's changes that come about by them being gone. One of the things this involves the Senate more than the House is when it comes to confirmation appointments, people that need to be confirmed by the Senate. If the Senate is gone, the president gets the option to just appoint somebody, and then they are on the clock. They can actually have the position up as long as Congress has to approve them at some point between now and the end of their current term, which for the current Congress we are sitting in would be January 3rd, 2027. And as long as the Senate would confirm that person, they get to keep their job for the remainder of their time in that position. But if they don't, they immediately lose their job. They have to bring up somebody else. But see, they don't have to do anything until the very end of the term. So this person could stay in that position for a while, and they get to appoint somebody without the consent of Congress, just because by saying, well, you weren't here to do it, you have to do it later. But by doing these 3-day sessions, they're never fully adjourned. The president doesn't get to do that. That's what the Supreme Court had ruled on. So because it changes the dynamic for how long they are out and what that means as far as what can happen, they do these pro forma sessions. So you would have somebody come in and say, hey, Donald Trump just vetoed this bill. We got to get back in session. And they would call Mike Johnson, who we don't know how he's going to vote on the Epstein files. His vote is going to be telling. If he votes to release the files, that gives me greater hope that they would try to pass it around Donald Trump's veto, that he would actually bring the House back in session if they were gone for Thanksgiving or something like that when it gets passed. So then they would call the House back in, they would call the Senate back in, and they would start the process of passing it around his veto. And they only have so many days. It is a rapid process. I think it's like 10, not counting Sundays. So they would do all of this. And Donald Trump is hoping that he can use the holidays, he can maybe get the Senate to kill it or something. That is why he is saying, go ahead, vote for it. It's no big deal. But what happens when 100 senators break rank with Donald Trump? Well, he's going to be looking over his shoulder. Now, by him saying go ahead and vote for it, he's hoping that's enough to diffuse the situation and make it so that they're not viewed as breaking ranks. But what happens if he vetoes it? And he still could. Do they pass it around his veto? Well, probably. Like we were just talking about, the numbers. I don't imagine if they pass it with 100 Republicans breaking ranks and voting with the Democrats, I don't see any of those 100 turning around when it comes down to voting against or to override a veto, that they would vote against Donald or against the bill. Why would they vote for it the first time and then not vote to pass it around his veto? Now, they can't make any changes when they vote to pass it around a veto. It's got to be the exact bill, or it starts the process over and Donald Trump could veto it again. So they could just pass it around his veto. But there's another thing that we're watching. And while they're not publicly saying that this could happen yet, something I have been wondering is, could they use this as their means to impeach and remove Donald Trump? Sounds crazy to say that they are talking about doing this, and I think they are. They're watching his poll numbers turn to shit. He's not winning this Epstein fight. They could potentially still get dragged through the mud when it comes to the Affordable Care Act subsidies. They're losing the public opinion battle in that. People are saying that the Republicans can't govern because it's true, they can't govern. And they could be looking at the midterms. Now, I'm thinking that the Senate is in play in the midterms, that they could pick up 4 to 6 seats in the Senate. The 6 is very, very optimistic. 4 is closer to realistic, but more optimistic. But if they get 4, Donald Trump gets no appointments through Congress that are wild and crazy. And if they flip even the House or the Senate, just one of them, none of Donald Trump's priorities are going to get through the rest of his term. And Congress is looking at that. The Republicans are looking at that because they care about their own power. Politicians have typically, and this goes to both parties, they do the same thing. That's why you have some politicians that seem like they will never retire. They've been there forever. Thinking of Chuck Grassley from Iowa here, who is 92 and has been in the Senate longer than I've been alive. He likes the power. He is the longest tenured Republican. He is the president pro tem of the Senate right now. He is number three in line for the presidency. If something were to happen to Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and Mike Johnson all at the same time, or even staggered, but before they could fill those gaps, right? We would have a 92-year-old Chuck Grassley being sworn in as president, which is mind-boggling. But he stays there because he likes the power it gives him. He likes the prestige. He likes the legacy, all of it. So they're looking at whether or not they get reelected in the midterms. And I'm thinking the House could flip by 40 to 50 seats. And I was just talking about the Senate, 4 to 6 seats over in the Senate. If Republicans are worried about losing the midterms and losing big, they may be saying, hey, the only chance we have of salvaging ourselves in the midterms is to dump Trump. And they probably should have done it a long time ago. But when they decide to make this move, how do they get rid of him? Well, they could impeach him. And his vetoing of releasing the Epstein files may be enough. And not necessarily just because he vetoed a bill, but specifically this bill, especially after now coming out publicly saying, go ahead and vote for it. Why? Because there's enough public support behind releasing the files. This is bipartisan that we want to see it, and MAGA wants to see it. Now, they could be playing a mental gymnastics game here, or a mental math game here, where they're looking at it going, okay, well, if we vote to release the files, MAGA's going to like us, even though Donald Trump doesn't want to release them. But can we use the files to go against Donald Trump, get him out of there because he's doing us no good, and still keep that MAGA base voting for us? One of the things they've been worried about has been losing that 30 to 35% of Republicans that are MAGA, that will vote lockstep with MAGA at every turn or vote with Donald Trump. And if Donald Trump says turn against that person, they'll turn against him. If he says we're going to primary that person, I back that candidate, they'll vote for that candidate. Those kind of things. The Republicans in Congress are hoping to still capture that 30 to 35% of the voter base and keep getting reelected. They're afraid that if that 30 to 35% doesn't vote for them, maybe votes for somebody else, they would never probably shift and vote for a Democrat. But it could be enough to push the Democrat over the finish line and that they get voted out. That is one of the things that I'm staring at going, that's why I think the Democrats could pick up 40, 50 seats in the midterms. So they're trying to play this mental gymnastics game with whether or not they can move away from Trump. So they can use the Epstein files. They vote to impeach him. And I've been saying this from the beginning. If the Republicans in the House of Representatives bring articles of impeachment against Donald Trump, if they do it before the midterms, while they are still the majority in the House, the trial, well, it will happen. It will be public. It'll be televised, all of that. And of course, I'll be covering it. But I would be willing to bet that the trial gets voted to convict. Because I just don't see the Republican Party, and I would probably say the same thing about the Democrats, that they wouldn't bring impeachment charges against a member of their own party if they didn't think that they would have the votes to remove Donald Trump. Now, if they remove Donald Trump, that would be shocking. But they could do it. Why? To set up J.D. Vance as a sympathetic president. By saying, well, look, he got thrown into this. Yes, he was the VP, but we just had to get rid of Donald Trump. He was so bad. But J.D. Vance has only got his feet under him, for 3 months or 6 months or whatever the time frame is going into the midterms, that they're going to try to say, well, he needs to have the rest of his term with us in charge in Congress so we can really get stuff done when we're not hampered by Donald Trump being president. And trying to use that to spin up the narrative to give J.D. Vance a sympathetic edge and hoping that helps get them reelected. So yeah, they could decide to get rid of Donald Trump and go to J.D. Vance because they are convinced that they need to make him sympathetic to give them a narrative to maybe win the midterms or maybe not lose the midterms nearly as badly. It also helps them going into 2028. How does this help them in 28? Well, J.D. Vance is going to probably be the Republican nominee in 2028. Now, I say probably. Why? Because we don't know what their primary is going to look like, how this is going to play out. I don't think Donald Trump makes it to 2028. And the name Trump is going to be synonymous with a loser, a fraud, potentially somebody connected to everything horribly done by Epstein and a sex trafficker or somebody who abused young girls. So I don't think it's going to be any of the Trump kids, despite what some of them might have said. But if Donald Trump does not live till 2028, J.D. Vance will be the incumbent president. And unless J.D. Vance decides not to run, he would be the choice that you would make for your party. This is why I was so pissed at Democrats in 2024. You may remember in 24, I said Joe Biden was the choice. He was the incumbent president. There was a primary most people forget about. Why? Because there was only two primary challengers. One was Marianne Williamson, who I think at her best got 3 or 4% of the vote in any given state, and RFK Jr., who was only on the ballot for like 3 states. And then he dropped out, decided to run as an independent. He was just a spoiler candidate. He was there to be a third alternative old white dude when the choice was between 2 old white dudes. And he was hoping that he would pull off enough reasonable minded people, and I use that term loosely if you're supporting RFK Jr., but reasonable minded people that would absolutely refused to vote for Donald Trump, but didn't want to vote for Joe Biden, but wouldn't vote for Donald Trump at all and would vote for Joe Biden if they had to. He wanted to be that third voice. And by doing that, he was going to potentially try to take numbers away from Joe Biden to make it easier for Donald Trump to win. Now, that was ultimately the goal. And we see that because he ended up joining the Trump administration. Well, where I was going with that was when Joe Biden said he was running, he was the incumbent. The Democrats shouldn't have even had really a primary. They did, but usually you don't. And it happens to go the way it did with Joe Biden holding this primary with RFK Jr. and Marianne Williamson for most of it. The incumbent president gets like 96% of the vote. And he got 96, 97% of the vote most of the way through. So that's what would happen with J.D. Vance. If he's the incumbent president, unless he is that hated by Republicans, and that's another possibility, they get to 2028, and I don't think any reasonable Republican runs. I really don't. I think you're going to see either some far-right nut job maybe challenge J.D. Vance. Again, I don't believe Donald Trump makes it, but doesn't matter. He's ineligible to run in 28 anyway. But I don't think any reasonable Republican that you could throw out there that would, under normal conditions, have a chance to win the presidency. I don't see it happening. Now, who could they bring out? Well, if they're not running J.D. Vance, maybe you go with Marco Rubio. Hell, maybe RFK Jr. tries to make a run for it as a Republican. But I think anybody in this administration is going to be, mostly tainted. So they may just have no choice but to run J.D. Vance unless Vance himself chooses not to be the nominee. So what do? They run J.D. Vance and whoever his running mate might be, whether that's Marco Rubio, whether he tries to get somebody more reasonable or whoever. No good Republican is going to want to run against whoever the Democrats put up. They would much rather, again, spin a narrative, wait 4 years, and then blame the Democrat for not fixing things fast enough and try to get back into power that way, even though they're the ones responsible for everything that has gone wrong. Donald Trump has fucked up this economy, he has fucked up this country, and it is going to take years to fix. Now, but what I was saying about J.D. Vance and them wanting a narrative, okay, even if Democrats still have the House and the Senate after the midterms, if they pick them up, and J.D. Vance becomes president after the midterms, okay, Republicans could spin this narrative of, well, see, J.D. Vance didn't have a real term. Democrats had control of both chambers. He couldn't pass anything. You got to give him another term, and you got to put us back in power so we can pass stuff. Then we'll really fix it. That's the best narrative they've got. But they don't want to run a decent candidate, somebody like a Brian Kemp, Chris Christie, trying to think of other decent Republicans, and there's not many left. Most of them have been run out of the party. Now, somebody today was asking me a couple things, and this was also kind of brought up on the Substack Live that the Rational Boomer did last night. What happens when Donald Trump is gone? One of my coworkers was asking me what happens to the ballroom when Donald Trump is gone. And I think it's going to depend on how far along is the ballroom. If it's like it is right now where they haven't even started, it is entirely possible that J.D. Vance just says, okay, ballroom was a dumb idea. Let's scrap that idea. It goes to Congress, gets them to approve money, and says, hey, we are just going to rebuild the East Wing. Make a few modifications, rebuild the East Wing, basically make it look like it did before. I could see that happening. And then maybe if it's almost done, J.D. Vance may end up just trying to finish it out, etc. But then that would leave the question up to the next Democratic president what do? And a lot of people are saying they want to see the ballroom torn down and the East Wing rebuilt. And that probably is what's going to happen. But again, that is most likely going to take, uh, government taxpayer money. It just is. Um, I even think that they're going to try to slip some funding in here somewhere for this remodel into one of the funding bills that we didn't know, and we probably didn't even notice that it was slipped in there. And they're going to use public money or taxpayer money to fund the ballroom that nobody wanted. But I could see them doing that either way. Now, the ballroom as it's been built doesn't make a lot of sense. 90,000 square foot ballroom should hold more than I'm hearing numbers of 650 to 900 people. You don't need 90,000 square feet. Think of how big some places like, like a Lowe's or a Home Depot, a lot of those stores are 90,000 square feet wall to wall. And if you're thinking about that as being a 90,000 square foot space, if you get rid of all the shelving and everything, you start looking at it, that's a big area. Now I realize you got to have room for if you're doing a ballroom, there would be a dance floor, there would be seating, there would be probably, other areas that would be off. But still, 90,000 square feet seems like an awful big area to only be able to squeeze in even under 1,000 people. So they're going to have a choice to make as far as what to do with the ballroom, if that's going to be done. But then the other half of that question was, what happens when Donald Trump is out of the picture? Well, when he's gone, and probably when Democrats are back in, because I don't expect anything to be done when it comes to Republican J.D. Vance being in office. I still think he is going to be president before the end of this term. And I would find it funny if Joe Biden outlives Donald Trump. Everyone was so worried about Joe Biden living to the end of his term, and that's why one of the reasons why they pushed so hard to get him to drop out. And then he drops out, and then they don't back his replacement. So, but I would still find that funny if he survives and Donald Trump doesn't. But anyway, what's going to happen when Democrats are back in charge? Again, not expecting anything to happen from a Republican. Well, one of the things they need to do, and I'm afraid of what they are actually going to do, what they need to do is send in a team of forensic accountants. And this is going to be a long, drawn out process and go over the books for all of the government agencies, including the ones that Donald Trump tried to unlawfully shutter. Most of the agencies that he has closed or he has done things with or renamed or whatever that he's trying to deal with, he did so without the approval of Congress when it was required. And they need to go through every single department and effectively do what DOJ should have done and do it right. You don't send in a team of barely out of college or barely out of high school tech boys with nicknames like Big Balls and send them running roughshod through all these government agencies looking for waste, fraud, and abuse when they don't know what the fuck is up. They don't know what these department needs. They don't know what these even the people in the departments do or what requirements you have to work there. They were just looking for ways of slashing a whole bunch of stuff and breaking things effectively. So you need to send in forensic accountants. And actually, that would do a lot of good. They would start going through, looking through line by line, figuring out where the money's going, where has the money gone if it's already spent, what projects are over budget, what projects, where did Donald Trump move money around? Because he's paying for a lot of things where it doesn't seem like those departments were going to have funding left. And they never seemed to run out of money, and Congress never approved more. So was he moving money around from programs that, he shouldn't have been touching to fund things that Congress never approved? So they need to go in and do a forensic accounting of the government. And this could take a year. This could take 2 years for as big as depending on how many people they put on it and all of it. And then that report needs to be given to Congress. Okay? They need to do a deep dive look into this and look in line by line, figure out where the money went, and maybe go back beyond just this administration. I don't know how far back they need to go. Do they need to go back to Biden? Do they need to go back to the first Trump presidency? Do they need to go back through Obama? Maybe start with this administration, see what they find, and then while they are hammering out and fixing the problem from this administration, then they need to start maybe going back, because while Joe Biden and his administration wasn't moving money around illegally, once you've started the process of doing forensic accounting, I don't know if they would look at everything, in its entirety, going how far they would go back, or if they would only go back so far and then they would do another round. But we need to figure out what accounts have what money in it, etc. And then Congress needs to do a round of appropriations to figure out what needs money, right? So if we find out that the emergency fund for SNAP had been depleted, okay, and that it was spent illegally on something else, well, Congress needs to at least reappropriate the money and get that back. But then they need to go after, the DOJ should go after people who misappropriated money because it is illegal. Congress has the power of the purse. It is not up to Donald Trump or Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, or anybody else to decide if those appropriations are correct. They just have to follow them out and do what was approved. So DOJ needs to be looking into it. They need to do a forensic account of all of the government's books, figure out where our money is going. And if anybody can be charged or should be charged, they need to be. Now, one of the problems with this administration is they all believe that Donald Trump's presidential immunity extends beyond Donald Trump, that they are somehow safe because Donald Trump will either save them, or that the immunity applies, or I'm just following orders will work. Remember, the I'm just following orders defense did not work in the Nuremberg trials after the World War II, where they were taking 1930s Nazi Germany soldiers, and that they were being put on trial for the things they did during the war. The I'm just following orders was not considered a valid defense, because you should be looking at that and trying to figure out, was it a valid thing? Should I have said no? Am I reasonably minded enough to say that's fucked up? We shouldn't be doing that. So after they do the accounting and they hold those people accountable, then we need to look at some of the other stuff. For example, I mentioned the ballroom. Okay, they need to look at who authorized the ballroom to be torn down. Yes, it would probably have come, or not the ballroom, the East Wing. But who authorized the East Wing to be torn down? Well, Donald Trump said to tear it down. Okay, but he had to call, he probably didn't make the call to the construction company that came out and demolished it. Somebody made that call. Who made that call? Okay, why didn't they say, no, Donald Trump, we can't do that, that's fucked up? Well, they didn't do that. They kept going, right? And all of those people along the way, DOJ needs to be looking into all of them. We need a better attorney general than the one we currently have in Pam Bondi, who is just a yes woman for Donald Trump, who is going to turn around and just do whatever he wants. And we need somebody better than Merrick Garland, somebody who's going to sit on his hands and say, well, we don't want to appear political. So, that being said, they need to look into those things. And then they just need to keep going through the list of all of the things Donald Trump has done, looking at what the military has done in Venezuela, blowing up these fishing boats. Okay? Again, the people in the military that are following these orders, that are carrying them out, that they are supposed to refuse unlawful orders. And now, I never served, I've said that before, but I know people who have. And from the creators I've seen and from the people I know in my personal life that have served, they all say the same thing. Not following an unlawful order was what they were told to do. That was instilled in them, that they are only to follow lawful orders. So you could have military personnel being uh, held up against the U.S. What is it? USCMJ, the U.S. Code of Military Justice. They could be facing court-martial and proceedings because they followed Donald Trump's illegal, unlawful order. And just go through step by step and fixing all of it. Now, one of the things that got brought up on the Rational Boomer Substack Live was packing the Supreme Court. And I think that is something that should be a very real possibility. I think they need to expand the Supreme Court when Democrats get power again to 13. And they can expand it to 13 while at the same time limiting future administrations from being able to expand the court. How? Well, if they pass the law making it 13, because there are 13 lower courts, 13 district courts, okay? So you put 13 justices on the Supreme Court, because one for each lower court. That makes sense. And if they make it so that is always the case going forward, that the law says, hey, you can only have as many Supreme Court justices as you have district courts, and that they can't remove district courts to eliminate justices, something like that. That'd be a good idea. Now, you may need a constitutional amendment to do something like that, because to make it a hard limit that they can't just pass a law the next time Republicans are in power and say, well, we're in power now, we're just gonna change that so we can have 15 or 17 or whatever. One of the reasons why both sides don't want to change what is going on is because they're afraid that, okay, Democrats in 4 years, if they're back in power, like I think they will be, that they'll say, well, we're going to make it 13. And then if 4 years after that, should a Republican become president, they'll say, well, we're going to make it 15 and balance it out again, or we're going to make it 17. Next thing you know, you got 99 Supreme Court justices. They can't agree on a damn thing. And the Supreme Court's useless. Well, 13 doesn't seem like that big of a number. It's only one more than a jury pool. And we use juries for a lot of criminal cases. Well, of course, max jury is usually 12 unless you're talking about a grand jury situation. So that wouldn't be a bad idea. And then, of course, speaking of the Supreme Court, we need to start looking at what we can do to fix the Supreme Court. This court that was put together by Donald Trump is showing how bad the Supreme Court is, how much we need an effective Supreme Court, and how we need to look at everything going on and making sure that it functions the way it should. We need a working code of ethics for the Supreme Court and a way to start the proceedings to remove justices who violate the code of ethics. Now, right now, the only way to remove a Supreme Court justice, and this is where a constitutional amendment may come into play, the only way to remove a Supreme Court justice is with impeachment. And we've never successfully impeached and removed a Supreme Court justice. But if we have an independent counsel or something that looks at ethics violations, and maybe it's one of those things where every year, that they make a recommendation to Congress every so often for, well, this justice has gotten ethics violations, repeatedly, we need to do something. And maybe that's when they have to take up, potentially it triggers a vote within so many days where they have to consider impeaching and removing on a standardized form for repeated ethics violations. Something like that. I don't know. I don't have all the answers. It was just something I've been thinking about, that would make it easier to get rid of some of these justices who we find out have taken all of these luxury gifts and things like that they're taking hundreds of thousands of dollar trips and concert tickets and sporting event tickets, all these things. I mean, I've worked jobs in retail, and whether or not it was entirely legal, because um, there's a question about about legality when it comes to tips. I worked for multiple companies that say you're not allowed to take the tip because we're a non-tipped location. Okay, but then somebody does get, it would rarely happen, but you would get a tip, and if they found out about it, there was a chance they could fire you just for accepting it, because their idea was, we pay you a living wage, or above the minimum wage at least, and we're paying you fairly, so you shouldn't need tips from our customer base. Well, if they were threatening to fire one of my coworkers years ago over like taking a $1 or a $2 tip, if they could get fired over a $1 or $2 tip working at a retail establishment, why can't a Supreme Court justice be removed for taking $200,000 vacation? Or in the case of Clarence Thomas, he sold his mother's house to a billionaire, who then turns around. Clarence Thomas's mother still lives in that same house, pays no rent, and the guy did a complete renovation for her. All while charging her no rent, no upkeep, no nothing. How is that not viewed as a conflict of interest on the part of Clarence Thomas? That should very clearly be a ethics violation. Now, I'm not saying he couldn't sell her house. That wasn't where the problem came from. The problem comes from the fact that he sold it to a multi-millionaire, multi-billionaire, I think it was billionaire, and then his mother is still living in the house a decade or 2 decades later, having never paid a dime in rent or anything like that, and the remodel. That should be viewed as a massively illegal gift and an ethics violation. And then you fix the ethics so many ethics violations should trigger some kind of a proceeding to where you can't have it be partisan. Now, sure, maybe it only calls for the vote, kind of like this discharge petition is doing for the Epstein files. Okay, maybe that calls for that vote. And then you got to see, is there enough to move it forward? Sure, maybe there would be more movement and more impeachment votes on certain members of the Supreme Court, and maybe not even stop it at the Supreme Court. Maybe look at what we can do to trigger certain things that would trigger automatically, where they would have to hold votes on members of the cabinet too. There's got to be a way to make this a smoother process, to be able to get rid of some of these people in the administration, in the Supreme Court, or where have you, that would allow us to actually have a functional government. Now, the minute I say anything like this, I know there's going to be some people probably in the comments or even listening that are going to say, well, it could be abused by Republicans. So then if you figure out how they're abusing it, you change it and you make it better so it doesn't keep getting abused. But you can't just sit there and go, well, we got to do it the way we've always done it because the Republicans could cheat. Well, yeah, and look at what we've been doing that for decades. Look at where that has gotten us. At this point, that has gotten us to right here, right now, and we have nothing to show for it. We've got a corrupt Supreme Court taking luxury trips and having their mother's house paid for and with no rent and all kinds of things just continuing to happen with no way of doing anything. So that's something else we need to look at. And then we need to start putting in more guardrails. Now, one of the things we talked about going into Donald Trump's presidency the second time was that the guardrails were going to hold. The courts were going to hold. They were going to be able to do things like what they were doing, saying, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. The courts were telling Donald Trump no, but we also thought Congress was going to tell Donald Trump no and actually hold the line. They need to have some serious conversations and look at passing several constitutional amendments. Now, what kind of amendments do they need to pass? Well, the Equal Rights Amendment would be one. Voting rights would be another, considering that the Supreme Court is looking at overturning some of the Voting Rights Act, saying, well, we don't need that anymore. Civil rights has kind of run its course. Well, in my opinion, if you pass a law because of civil rights to make sure everybody has the right to vote, and you can't do X, Y, and Z based on race and gender and gender identity and all of these things, if you get to a point where you don't need that law anymore, you shouldn't just scrap the law and say, it's run its course. You leave the law on the books. So what if it doesn't do anything? I mean, there are towns in Iowa that still say, you must have a hitching post outside your hotel for your horse. Who rides a horse to town anymore? And nobody has the hitching post. But they never bothered to repeal the law because it doesn't come into play. You could do the same thing with something like Equal Rights or Voting Act or whatever. Pass it, and if it never comes up again, it never comes up again. You get it passed, you get to the point when society doesn't need it, and you leave it alone and let things take its course and go from there. Beyond the Equal Rights and the Voting Act, they need to also look at passing some kind of an amendment or something limiting who can be president. Maybe no convicted felons would be a good start. Maybe some kind of a independent medical exam for people over a certain age, where they have to prove their cognitive ability. Now, Donald Trump talks about his cognitive ability, about the fact that he's taken these really hard aptitude tests and nobody could pass but him. And he's describing the Montreal Cognitive Assessment. And the fact is, he's taken it more than once. And that is something they give you when they think you've had a brain damage, they think you've had a brain injury, or they're worried that you may have had a stroke or dementia or something like that. It is not a standardized test. So maybe that is something they need to look at and look into doing and adding in as a requirement if you are over a certain age to be president. They also need to, and it would be hard to do, pass some kind of constitutional amendment, because that is what it would take, is passing an amendment to add in age and term limits to Congress. Because we have too many people who are holding on to the levers of power for far too long. Now, maybe this may be the last couple generations that hold on to those levers of power for as long as they have. And maybe that won't be needed. But simple fact of the matter is we've got people in Congress that have been doing it for 40 plus years. And we have people who were like Chuck Grassley. He was in his 40s, I think, when he was elected the first time. And he has been in the Senate since before I was born. He has got grandkids that have never not known Chuck Grassley to be in the Senate. In fact, his one grandson, Pat Grassley, is the Speaker of the Iowa House. He is in his early 40s. And as far as I know, he has never known a year of his life where his grandpa wasn't in the Senate. And he's only ever seen his grandpa get more and more powerful the longer and the more longevity he has gotten, etc. So they need to look at passing some kind of constitutional amendment, because I think that's what it would take to put age limits and term limits. Now, I don't know if we're looking at 18 years. I don't know if we're looking at 12 years. I don't know if you want to put in different term limits for for each house because you got differing terms. That's possible. But maybe we need to look at doing something at a combination of both. Up to so many terms, because I think at 25 is the youngest you can be to be a member of the House of Representatives, and I believe you have to be 30 to be a senator. So what does that look like? Well, they don't need to go in. If they get elected at 25, you don't need to be 65 or 70 before you're out. I don't know if 65 is the cutoff. I don't know if they want to set it at the same age as Social Security retirement, but something. They need to do something to fix it. And then they just need to keep going through step by step and shoring up all of the things and all of the problems that we have and fixing it so that these things and these issues don't come creeping back up. So we're not right back where we started after Donald Trump is gone. We get rid of Donald Trump. We want to prevent the next coming of that. And that is what we've done a good job of that so far throughout our history of we see a problem, we fix it. And now we just got to do it on a big scale. This is probably going to be one of the biggest changes to the American government in a long time because we have so many things to fix. All right. So that is going to do it for today on the Analytical Iowan podcast. That is the last story I've got for you, the last idea I've got for you, I guess. We're starting a new week. We got more stuff coming up. There's going to be even more things coming out with the Epstein files. And as the last batch of things keep getting dug through, we're going to hear even more and more. It's going to be bad news for Donald Trump. We're watching to see how the vote goes later in the week, Wednesday, I believe, and how they vote to release the files or what they do there. So as we're going to keep our eyes on that. I'll be back tomorrow. We got even more to talk about because we always do. I want to thank you for joining me today on the Analytical Iowan podcast, and have a great day, and I will talk to you tomorrow.
That was Eric. That does it for our analysis today. If you appreciated us cutting through the noise to get to the critical context, please make sure you're subscribed to the Analytical Iowan podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.